Hello, everyone. I'm Leah Thomas from the marketing team, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, all about why 47-day TLS demands automation. I have Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer, and Nick France, Chief Technology Officer here for you today. The presentation is being recorded, and we will share it with you afterwards, most likely tomorrow. And finally, if you have any questions during the presentation, send them over. Please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. Nick and Tim, let's get started.
Thank you, Leah. Tim Callan here. So one of the things that occurred in recent months that you may or may not be aware of, but we'll give you the details of today, is that the CA Browser Forum has passed a definite ballot that is stepping the maximum term of a public SSL certificate down to eventually in 2029, 47 days. And this has led to a number of conversations with our own customers and partners about automation. And the shortening certificate lifespans by their nature drive people to look into automation, and then that drives a bunch of other questions, which is to say, what's the cost, what's the benefits, what do I get from automation more generally? And it's indicated us that clearly there's an appetite among a lot of people to better understand what we call the ROI of certificate automation, or the ROI of CLM. And so Nick and I tried to put something together for you today that would go over how to think about it and what to look at there. So, you'll see the agenda here, right? The true cost of manual certificate management. There are a variety of disadvantages to manual certificate management, and you may not be thinking about all of them, so we want to clarify that. And therefore, that leads directly into what is the ROI of automation? When you do automation, what are the benefits you get? And how do you, for want of a better word, put a price tag on these? And some of this is hard, right? But we want to at least help guide you in doing that. We do have an ROI calculator, which we'll tell you about. We'll talk about, once you feel like you understand the ROI, or the TCO might even be a better word, the total cost of ownership. Once you feel like you understand the TCO, how do you build this business argument to give to other people inside your organization who maybe don't understand certificate management the way you do? And then we will give you a deep dive on the 47 days and what you need to do and how that influences your timelines of approach to this. So the recap. So this has been a conversation since early 2023, when Google really threw down the gauntlet and said, listen, we're going to be trying to reduce the maximum lifespan of a certificate to 90 days, is what Chrome said at the time. And that was the starting point. And then 2 years went by where the industry talked about that. And the end point on that was that in April of 2025, the CA Browser Forum passed a ballot driven by Apple that will reduce the maximum term of an SSL certificate in stages, eventually down to 47 days. And we've got a whole slide where we'll show you those dates and maximum dates. So don't worry about that right now. But eventually down to 47 days. That is done. That is official CA Browser Forum policy as of early May. And that is it. That is happening. That's the policy. It's not an if. It's not even a when. It's all laid out. We're just going to watch these procedures actually take place. And so this is good, right? This is healthy for the WebPKI. It's healthy for the internet users out there in the world, and bad for the bad guys and good for the good guys. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. Shorter lifespan certificates are just plain more secure. It gives us more agility in terms of swapping out our cryptography and staying current on our cryptography, which is a hot topic, right? Automation fundamentally is better because it's less error prone, it's more efficient, and it kind of flocks together with a lot of other good practices. Nick, I know you're a big advocate of shorter lifespans. You actually endorse the Apple ballot. So do you want to talk about this?
Yes, cheers, Tim. So yeah, I think you said it right. Then they are just more secure. I think the best way to look at it that I usually say is that shorter is better. We all know certificates can have problems with them. They can be, misissued with incorrect information. There can be a key compromise, or they can use, as we've seen before, like outdated cryptographic algorithms and stuff, and be weak essentially. And back when you and I started in this business, we were able to issue certificates for 10, 15, maybe more years. And so if
Right.
something is bad and it's out there for 10 or 15 years before someone gets round to replacing it, or it no longer causes a security concern, that's bad. And so the idea of having that lifetime reduced down reduces the window of risk to everybody. And you've got to understand with TLS certificates that we're talking about, the everybody that could be impacted by a certificate that's bad or misissued is literally everybody. It's anybody with a browser, with a phone, with a laptop, with a desktop.
Right.
We are all the parties to this. And so we want it to be safe, and shorter is ultimately better. But it definitely brings in a lot of these other bullets that we have on the slide here, Tim, as well. Things like agility and flexibility. We want to change some of these standards, or if one of these algorithms gets broken for some reason, we don't want to wait 5 or 10 years for people to
Yeah.
swap their certificates out. We want to be able to do that much, much quicker than we can today.
Right. And that was that one actually that you bring that up. That's where I think the deprecation of SHA-1 was a real eye opener for a lot of people. And I know this included people who work in the Rootstore programs, where what happened was it was becoming increasingly clear that SHA-1 was not a usable algorithm moving forward. And so the CA Browser Forum got together and banned it. Said, you can't have SHA-1 as of a certain date. As of this date, you can't issue any more certs with SHA-1. And at that time, the maximum span for a public TLS cert was 3 years. And so literally there were certificates plus some time, there's some extra time, right? It was beyond 3 years. So there literally were certificates that were issued, the day before the ban on SHA-1, that 3 years later was still in use, right? In production, sitting on servers, securing or supposedly securing connections. And they weren't misissued. They weren't non-compliant. They were perfectly compliant. And that was, I think, a time where a lot of people started to say, you know what? Long certificates are a problem. And they're fundamentally a problem because they prevent the degree of cryptographic agility that we really require. Right? That's just too long and it's not okay.
Really
Yeah.
is, and as I
Yeah.
say, that poses a risk to everybody. But I think the last point or two on this slide as well, Tim, are worth mentioning. Is technology has brought about a lot of automation in general, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
building images for your employees' laptops and desktops and things, or just doing any task that you have to repeat more frequently, should be automated. And those automations can follow best practices. It can make sure things are done correctly, keys are generated correctly, the data is entered correctly. So the whole point of these shorter lifetimes is going to drive automation, which is going to drive things like efficiency. It's going to drive best practices. It's going to drive standardization. So it does give us all the benefits we talked about. But automation in general is just something that we should want for any kind of task that we repeat more frequently.
Yeah.
And so it's going to drive that as well. It's going to drive this adoption of best practices with automation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and this, of course, is getting worse. This whole situation is getting worse because as the certificate lifespans go down, the need to engage in manual processes just goes up. So there's some costs here that maybe we might consider obvious, right? And this is basically the employee cost, right? You have to pay people with a certain skill set. It is an expensive skill set. And these people need to be there to manually install certificates and make sure it's done on time, reliably, every time, done correctly. Remember, every certificate expires. So it's not just standing up new machines, but it's replacing the certificates on the machines you already have. Because once a year you're touching those, right? And and part of the problem with that is that for most organization in the world, there is an IT skills gap, which is to say we have more IT things we could be doing than we can get qualified IT people to do them. So you don't just have this direct kind of payroll consequence, you also have the opportunity cost of the IT skills gap, which is to say I can't be working on other projects that I want to work on because I can't have the certificates expiring without being replaced. And so those are kind of the obvious ones, I think, that people think about a lot. But there are some other costs you want to think about as well, right? And the first one is just the risk of expiration. Like we routinely see, don't we, Nick, right? Like instances of major technology savvy companies, large banks, born in the cloud tech companies, having outages that ultimately attribute themselves back to certs that weren't renewed successfully.
Absolutely. We have seen, I think our marketing team keep a running list of the various outages and as you say, big techcos that have problems due to expired certificates. And I would add to that, part of the reason for that, not just obviously the problems of a certificate expiring, but it's where certificates are required nowadays. Again, back when we could issue a 10 or a 15-year certificate, even the big players like Amazon had a certificate on the page where you logged in or you entered your credit card details. They didn't really use it as widely as they do today. Now, you cannot have a website or a web service or anything that doesn't have a certificate. So the risk of an expiry of that certificate affects your whole business, affects your whole infrastructure, and not just maybe one site or one login page.
Absolutely. There's this cascading failures thing we see, right? Where every system is tied to every other system and depends on it. And as a result, once one system goes down, it's like when you knock down one pole, eventually the whole tent comes down because it's all connected and it falls. And we've seen this over and over again, right? A great example of this was the O2 outage in 2018, where everybody who used O2, the mobile service, was without service for basically a day. And it went back to a single expired certificate that wasn't renewed in a third-party service. It wasn't even O2, it was at Ericsson. And it took down their whole third-party service, which took down all of O2, all of SoftBank Cellular, and some other smaller cellular providers in other markets. And 40 million people without cell phone use for a day because of one certificate that wasn't expired. And that's what you're talking about, Nick, right? This cascading failure problem and the downtime. So you say, what was the cost of that, right? What is the cost of that downtime? It's been estimated that the SLA costs for Ericsson in that case were 100 million euros, right? So the cost of that downtime is huge and needs to be accounted for because there's always that risk. Connected to that, sometimes it's that a service doesn't work, or sometimes that's that a security system fails. And when the security system is the thing that fails, now your protections aren't up. And if your protections aren't up, that is leaving you with increased exposure to breach. So there's a real security risk that's attached to this as well. Compliance failure, right? A lot of times we have specific requirements from the compliance organizations we have to follow. PCI DSS is a great example. HIPAA, FISMA, Department of Defense, lots of governmental requirements in various nations around the world. And if you are not securing your connections or your data in motion, you're probably also achieving compliance failures that are going to have their own consequences, right? That you need to think of. And then just the efficiency thing. One of the things about the efficiency thing is you might think that you can get it done when you're touching these servers once a year, but start thinking about touching them once a month. And somewhere along the line, there's a critical line you cross where without radically re-resourcing your organization, if that's a word, I don't know if re-resourcing is a word, but without radically changing your organization's resources, you simply will not be able to do it like at all. And, that's one of the other risks that we're facing as the number of times we renew our certificates increases literally by an order of magnitude.
Yeah, and I think those last 2 points, Tim, again, make it, they kind of come together in terms of how prevalent the use of certificates and the use of TLS has become nowadays. I mean, it's
Right.
always been a great technology, always been a fundamental technology, but the drives that have come from the browsers over the past few years to make what they call HTTPS everywhere, your apps on mobile and your apps on desktop require TLS everywhere. The fact that this solution is now everywhere, it's not something you can opt out of. This is not something you can go, well, I don't like short lifetime certs, so I'm going to do something else, or I'm only going to do this with one certificate and I'm just going to manage that way. Those aren't things that you can choose anymore. They aren't decisions that you can make. You have to have certificates. You have to have them everywhere where there is, as you said, public communication or security in transport. And so you're going to have more and more guidelines that require it for compliance, and you are going to have a scale problem. You are not handling 1 or 2 certificates anymore. You are handling tens, hundreds, thousands, or in some cases, millions. And that's something you cannot do by hand. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I had a conversation on this topic with the person in charge of the certificate group for a Global 1000 firm. And he said to me, he said, when we get to the 6-month cadence, I think we can survive. But when we get down to the 90-day or the 3-month or the 1-month cadence, because it's just not going to work for us, right? And that's that inefficiency at scale thing coming into play. So what happens? How's it different when we automate, right? So again, the obvious one is that you don't need to do that work anymore. When you put automation in place, you can have automation that will automatically request and provision, and install those certificates for you. Those can be built directly into the orchestration tools that you want to use. And not only does that reduce your human involvement, the amount of times that humans have mice in their hands that are pressing buttons, but it also makes these installations extremely predictable, right? The risk for human error, because on this moment I had a lapse of attention because my phone rang at the wrong time, that goes away, right? And that's, I think that's the most obvious one that people see. But again, think about some of these other things, right? Visibility. An automation solution lets you see what you have. Lets you see when it's coming. Lets you see when it's going to go. You can do things like track expiration, and you can get a sense for how many certs you really have. And when something else shows up, a rogue cert that isn't in there, you can add it in, and now you have visibility on that one too, where before you didn't. So visibility and tracking and knowledge is another benefit that is not to be underestimated. And then just compliance, like we wrote here, policy enforcement, right? If I want to only use certain algorithms or certain key sizes or certain maximum term of my certs, or I only want my certs from certain CAs, I can know that. And I can be confident that that's really happening because I can make those into policies that must be followed. But otherwise, if I have individuals making their choices in the moment, maybe those individuals don't even know about that policy, or maybe they don't really care, or maybe they can't be bothered, or maybe they just want this to be done. And again, we see that kind of thing happening all the time. And then, of course, what's the ultimate benefit? The ultimate benefit is that the risk of outage goes down. The risk of errors goes down. And again, we talked about the cost, not just the cost of people, on the payroll, but the cost of those outages and errors and problems when they occur.
I just wanted to touch very quickly, Tim. I'm back on the first point here about the orchestrations and integration with those tools. I think that's a really good point to make, because one thing that people should start to think about a bit more is that certificates and TLS should become something that is not just automated and orchestrated, but is treated perhaps a little differently than it is today as part of that. So instead of thinking, oh, I've got this certificate, I need to buy it once a year, I need to renew it and set a calendar reminder 30 days in advance, it needs to become a core part of your infrastructure. When a service or a site or an app gets an IP address or gets a server or some virtual machines spin up, the TLS should be a component of that, right? It should be a component of infrastructure. It should be something that is orchestrated along with it, and not something that you are manually tracking separately in an Excel sheet or a calendar invite. It's got to be something that's treated like everything else when you deploy anything within your infrastructure. That's what it's got to be part of. And I think that kind of shift in some cases for the organizations that haven't done that yet will definitely help them be able to get over this hump of having to automate more and having to deal with shorter lifetimes.
Yeah, and think about a variety of different ecosystem components that this orchestration or this integration may occur with, right? So we could be talking about obviously your CLM, but we could be talking about your ITSM platform. We could be talking about your business intelligence platform. We could be talking about various DevOps tools, automated network management tools. These are all areas where you can see integrations having benefits, right? APM tools. So these are all areas where you can get extra benefit out of doing this. All right, so let's talk about the ROI calculator. So we have an ROI calculator that really accounts for the things that we talked about in the previous slides. So it's going to ask you a series of questions. And again, it's not just a simple brain dead, how many IT professionals do you have and what's their salary, right? It's going to be much more focused on the whole suite of things you want to consider. So it's going to attempt to codify the value of risk. It's going to attempt to put some value on compliance. It's going to attempt to do all of these other things. You can put them in, and then at the end of the day, you can get a sense for what you're getting, right? So we would like to recommend that you try this, right? Sectigo.convertcalculator.com/47day impact, which you see there, or just search for Sectigo ROI calculator. Might be easy to remember. Or Sectigo convert calculator. I'm really thinking that's a hard URL to remember. Sectigo 47-day calculator, we'll probably find it. So go put this in for yourself, right? And you can start getting a sense of your own numbers and what they really are for your organization. And then this is, and so this is the beginning of your task of educating other people in the organization about this is what certificate automation means for us. So here's some of the things to think about, right? You've got a variety of stakeholders, and stakeholders are going to have different triggers. They're going to have different points of interest, and you can talk to a lot of different things, right? So let's just talk about like what these are. Time spent per certificate. This is really helpful for the IT management team and the CIO, who is trying to look at how are we going to get our work done and how are we going to pull things in. How are we going to get things done sooner? How are we going to add things to our task list? How are we going to be more reliably get the things we've done? Well, if you save, 25 to 55 minutes per cert, that goes a long way.
Yeah, there's a potentially huge time saving between manual and automated.
Yeah.
Just to say, by the way, so when we're explaining ourselves to CLM here, certificate lifecycle management is what we call, the whole ecosystem, if you like, of tools and products and services available to manage your certificate estate. But it could be, depending on what kind of system or solution it is, that 30 to 60 minutes could be an underestimate, and the less than 5 minutes could be an overestimate in some cases. Getting a certificate through an automation could take, just a few seconds, Manually installing a certificate, if it's a particularly difficult system to get to, or you currently have some kind of change request process as part of that, that number could be much, much more. But like you said, for the high level kind of executive people and stuff, being able to give them a very simple breakdown of how much time alone this can save per certificate is a huge win.
Yeah.
It's freeing up resources. It's able to have resources to go and spend on something else that is perhaps more worthy than worrying about whether your certificates are going to expire.
Right. Great. I love it. And then the next one, risk of outage and breach. You start to say, well, who cares about risk of outage and breach, right? Well, risk of outage, I think the CIO cares, but also probably your head of infrastructure cares, or your head of operations. A variety of other people who depend on these services, like your head of customer service or your head of sales, right? Your CRO might care. When we start talking about risk of breach, now you have a CISO who definitely cares. And all of these things, risk of outage and breach, honestly, your CEO cares, your board cares, your CFO cares.
Yep.
So when you start really thinking about reducing the risk of very significant, costly, damaging downtime, there are a bunch of stakeholders who care about this in a big way, right? Staff
Yep.
productivity, the people who own that staff, again, the CIO or the CISO, those guys care. But also, how about your chief human resources officer, right? They're tasked with improving productivity. That's part of how they think. And that person now is a stakeholder. Compliance readiness, your heads of compliance, the people who are responsible for us, you being compliant to various organizations, right? Compliance is a very serious matter. GDPR is very serious. Starbucks is very serious. People have big fines when they get this stuff wrong. So having systems that work correctly and reliably and don't create those gaps, now you have a bunch of people who care, right? Your CFO and your chief of investor relations care. Your data privacy officer cares. Now you've brought another set of people in. Your board of directors cares. And then I think we talked about the security, right? Your CISO cares very quickly, because if your systems are going down, they're supposed to be protecting you. CISO suddenly cares in a big, big way. So as you're talking about this internally, think about that broad variety of stakeholders, all of whom have skin in this game. And how do you communicate to them? How do they understand the consequences of automation, the positive consequences of them? And how do they extend that their risk and their negative consequences are magnified tremendously as the maximum term for an SSL certificate goes down? And they are going down to 47 days. So, and again, early May, the following ballot was passed by the CA Browser Forum. It was passed in April. It went into effect in May. It became a rule in May. So today, the maximum term for a public SSL certificate is 398 days. You can think of this as a year plus a little bit. It's 13 months plus a day is what it is, but call it a year plus a little bit. And what that does is that allows you to be on a yearly cadence, but then you can renew a little early, or you can, if you have some kind of technical snafu and you have to solve it a few days late, you've got a little bit extra breathing, right? That's what it is. It's a year plus a little breathing room. So in March 15, 2026, the maximum term drops down to 200 days. Well, what's 200 days? 200 days is 6 months plus a little breathing room. So that allows us to go on to a 6-month cadence. So imagine that you're doing it in, March and September, right? And that becomes your cadence for that particular cert. A year later, March 15, 2027, goes down to 100 days. What's 100 days? 100 days is 3 months plus a little breathing room. So now imagine it's happening March, June, September, December, right? And now we're doing that thing 4 times a year. And then finally, 2 years after that, not 1 year, but 2 years after that, on March 15, 2029, we go down to 47 days. What's 47 days? It's 1 month plus a little breathing room. So now imagine that you're renewing this certificate on, let's say, second Tuesday of every month. And every second Tuesday, blam, we renew the certificate again. And then you got a little room. So if you want to do an early renewal, or if there's a technical problem and you discover it the following Monday, you could go fix it and you didn't have an outage, right? So that's the idea, is 1 month plus a little breathing room. So that's the vision for how that step down works. And so when we get to March 15, 2029, imagine that you're doing this 12 times a year, that you're doing this once a month. And then we have 2 other columns, DC reuse and OV reuse, but Nick, I think you want to say something about this.
Yeah, that was the bit I was going to say. The lead that often gets buried in this is
Right.
we talk primarily about the lifetime of the certificate itself that you just greatly explained, but there's 2 other components to this really. And I'll cover the far right one first, if that's okay.
Sure,
so
go for it.
What we have is the OV reuse period. OV or EV, that's the information we validate of your business and put it in OV and EV certificates. Now that is currently allowed at a maximum of 825 days. So we validate it once and then we don't have to do it again for another 2 and a bit years. Some CAs, including ourselves, revalidate that on an annual basis anyway.
You might not even know that.
Next year, you might not even
that
notice.
That might be invisible to you. Yeah.
But starting next year, the maximum lifetime for that data to be reused is going down to a year as well.
Yeah.
Now that one is probably largely inconsequential for most, because, as you say, that's already happening. It can be invisible in many cases after the very first validation, and so that's moving down to 1 year. But critically, and it is important to note, when we get down to 47-day certificates, a CA isn't required to revalidate your business information again every 47 days. That can be reused for a 1-year period. Now, the middle column is where things get a little more interesting. So the DCV reuse period is the amount of time that a CA like ourselves can do a domain verification. So that's when we ask you to prove that you control a particular domain name or a fully qualified domain name. Once that is done, it's how long we can rely on that and issue another certificate with that same domain name in it. Now, as it stands today, there is a maximum of 398 days alongside the lifetime of 398 days. So we can validate tim.com today. We can issue a 1-year certificate, but that validation can also stand for 398 days. And then on the 398th day, we could then issue another 398-day certificate on top of that. So you can see how that one validation could actually cover 2 whole years of validity for a certificate, which, as we talked about right at the start, shorter is better, it reduces risk, keeps everybody safer. So what we can see in that middle column is the DCV reuse period is being stepped down, mostly in line with the certificate term reduction, until we get to that date in 2029, where that DCV reuse period will be down to 10 days. Now, what does that mean for most people? What that means is you will have to not just replace your certificates as frequently as you talked about, Tim. You will need to revalidate the control of all of the domain names you issue certificates for, basically on a weekly date basis. So 10 days, let's say you want a little margin for error, you're going to be doing that weekly. And that means you absolutely need to automate that as well. So this isn't just about the certificates and where they are installed and where they live. This is also about ensuring that whoever deals with your certificates, your PKI team, have a great connection into your DNS and your domain teams, because they are going to need to do automation and integration there to be able to repeat this validation process on at least a weekly basis in the next couple of years.
And DNS automation is a real thing. There are tools and techniques and vendors that provide that today. And if there are gaps in your existing vendors and solutions, I think this step down is going to be very motivational for those vendors to close those gaps, right? They've got years to get it done. And if they don't get it done, you have time to switch vendors to somebody who does. So
the thing is, Tim, most of the automation we talk about has been available for a very long time. Let's be clear on that. It's been possible to automate a certificate and automate domain validation for a number of years now. Now, we'll talk in a few minutes about the different methods and how there are better methods to do it today and better protocols, but this isn't something brand new, right? I think that's a point to make as well, is yes, this will force DNS providers to offer better automation if they don't. This will force vendors to do certificate automation where they perhaps don't today, but this isn't something that should be brand new to anybody. This is something that's been possible for a long time and has been on the horizon for a long time as well, as being a requirement for every business.
Yep, agreed. So yeah, all of these things are things to be aware of and to track. And by the way, this isn't new. So the maximum term for an SSL certificate has been shrinking for a long time, since the original establishment of the EV guidelines back in 2007. All the way till now, we've seen a reduction in this. And it also doesn't only apply to SSL. We've seen similar things where the maximum term for code signing and SMIME have been capped, and those things are going down as well. So we should assume that this basic trend, though the dates are different and the maximum term is different, because every one of those things is dialed in on a product by product basis, you should assume that this trend is going to be the trend broadly and moving forward for the foreseeable future. All right, so between now and spring 2026, you're going to be in a 6-month cadence. You are. There are no exceptions. There are no delays. There are no, well, I need an extra year. You don't get one. So what does this mean, right? How we need a cadence, a timeline that'll get there. So here's our recommended timeline. You might dial this up and down for you a little bit. Think about it this way. Right now, you got to figure out what you have. One of the things we inevitably find when we talk to enterprises is there are certs being used in their organization that the certificate management group or the CIO or wherever you put it aren't aware of, because someone else somewhere in the organization went and got certs and put them on a server, and the company depends on those certs and those services, and if they went down, then there would be consequences. So find that stuff, identify it, because the people who bought those certs and put them up might not even know that this step down is coming. I might never know until it happens. They might have put something in the calendar, have a look at it a year, and they're obliviously going about their life. So you got to find these certificates. You got to know that they exist. Understand what you're going to need in terms of automation as your next step. Fall of 2025. Figure out what you need to implement so that you're not having a problem in less than a year. Winter of 2025, you need to be picking solutions and putting them in place, right? gotta be, this isn't a slow process here. By the winter, you need to be picking solutions and putting them in place, because then you've got a few months in the spring to make sure it's all working correctly and shake out the bugs and test it and feel confident and fix anything you need to fix and do those last minute jobbies, because starting in March 2026, March 15, you will be on 6-month certificates, and there are no exceptions. And then from there, the train keeps right on rolling. So it is already June, the gulp. It is surprisingly close to March 2026. We've got 9 months to get this done.
Yep, not a lot of time.
Yeah. So automation options, Acme is a huge one. A lot of people will be relying hard on Acme for a lot of things they do. That's great. There are other options. There are API options. We talked about the infrastructure or the ecosystem integrations that enter into all of this. We at Sectigo offer agents that you can deploy on large operating systems that will connect directly back to our system, and will automate the installation that way. So you have a variety of options, and you got to figure out which ones you're using and where. And by the way, you also might be using kind of a hybrid approach where I'm using some Acme and some agent, and I've also got an API integration. I've also got a connection to my ITSM, and that can happen, and that's perfectly legit. but this is the kind of thing to figure out, and you have these options. You got to figure out which ones you're going to use.
Yeah, I think one thing to mention on this, Tim, quickly is as we said earlier, there's a bunch of options now. Automation has been possible for a long time, even if it's not been as widely adopted as we'd like. Acme is obviously the gold standard now, and I think we have had a number of people say, "Well, Acme isn't everywhere. It's not always suitable in the enterprise, or my vendor doesn't support this, my vendor doesn't support that." And that is true. In many cases, there's lacking automation support. But I think, as you said right at the start of this presentation, the ballot for shorter lifetimes only just passed. It's essentially only just official a small number of weeks ago. And what that is going to do, as well as all these changes we're talking to you about with your enterprise, it's also going to start to force vendors to build in better automation because of the
Yeah,
demands that you, as the listeners of this webinar and the employees and owners of businesses and enterprises who need this, you have to put pressure on your vendors as well to say we need an automation solution here, whether that is Acme, hopefully in many cases, or whether it's some other kind of offering. These vendors will need to include this or they will get left behind. They will get discarded for other vendors who can build the automation support in, and then it's another thing that you don't have to worry about. So I think
yeah.
it's worth just mentioning that these are great standards, but I do think we can expect now this ballot has passed to see them more widely adopted and integrated into appliances and software and other things by vendors in the near future.
I think that's a great point, Nick. And I think the other point you make that I wouldn't mind just kind of putting a highlighter on is you, as the customer, have the power to influence those roadmap decisions. You can call your vendors and say, I need automation and I need it by this date. Because if you can't provide it by this date, that is when I need to shop for an alternative.
Yep.
And that can be a very powerful thing. Everybody attending this webinar, you have a lot of power to make your vendors give you the automation options that you need. And if you're stuck with one of those left behind vendors who don't anyway, then you need to know that because you need to leave them behind and move on to somebody who can. And if you're going to do that, that takes time and that's difficult. And so you want to know that early so you have time to make the changes you need to make. We talked about CLM, certificate lifecycle management. Sectigo does offer a certificate lifecycle management platform that does the kind of things we were talking about. It does certificate discovery. It does automatically provision and deploy. It does provide visibility with dashboards and reports and alerts. It does provide all of the capabilities that you would expect out of these circumstances. It does work with a broad variety of certificates. And internal and external PKI, different certificate types, multiple CA providers. It does have integrations with a broad set of other ecosystem solutions that you might care about. So that is a viable possibility. And if you're not using CLM today, absolutely, Sectigo can probably provide you exactly what you need. And with that, I think we are ready for, real quick. If this kind of conversation is interesting to you, I co-host a podcast with another one of our technical associates here at Sectigo. We have new episodes up every week. And we talk about changes in the world of certificates, the kind of things you saw here today, PKI, encryption, PQC, etc. All that sort of thing we're covering on a regular basis multiple times a week. It's just called Root Causes. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. We would love to have you join us and stay current. And with that, I think we are ready for questions.
Thank you, Tim. Yes. Does the 47-day change affect code signing or any other certificates?
No, is the answer to that.
Yeah.
No, we're specific. The changes specifically affect TLS certificates, server certificates, or as they're unfortunately still known, SSL certificates in many cases. But no, code signing isn't affected. SMIME, document signing, and all those other types aren't affected. However, I will slightly caveat that, unless Tim wants to stop me, is
Go
that
ahead, Nick.
many of those certificate types have seen a reduction in lifetime
Yep.
over the past few years, not all the way down to 47 days. We've seen S-MIME go maybe down to 2 years and code signing maybe go lower as well. But at the moment, this is not affecting them. There's no likelihood, I don't think, that we'll see 47-day code signing certificates, but I think it's good to be aware that lifetime on those has reduced somewhat as well over the past few years for many of the same reasons.
Absolutely agreed on all of that. And yes, I just ditto.
Right. The next question is, how are smaller online businesses going to cope with 47 days? Does automation make sense for smaller businesses?
Look,
I think in terms of it, well, yeah, I think in terms of it making sense, I don't know that there's a choice there. As Tim said several
yeah,
times, this isn't something that people can choose to opt out of or not have. We have seen this, or I've had the same question before saying, well, big companies have big teams to deal with this and smaller ones don't. I think in many cases it's certainly a valid concern. I do think, well, there's a number of points that I would say. Number one is the automation, once you have it set up, is definitely an easier solution. The idea of it is to be largely set and forget. You monitor it, you maybe get an alert if something goes wrong. You don't have to pass down the knowledge through different employees or different teams of how to run these incantations once a year to install a certificate on your infrastructure. Automation has like a slightly steeper curve at the start to get it set up, but then after that, it's much more easier to maintain and adapts to all of these new changes. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say in terms of small businesses is there's been a number of shifts in the industry in IT over the past few years that sounds like they've been impactful to those businesses, small businesses, but they've in fact been, useful. A good example might be many years ago, if you wanted to maintain your own small business website, you had to find a web designer or a web developer, and they're maybe writing HTML and stuff by hand, and they're uploading it, and they have to have a web server, and they have to do all that kind of stuff. Looking today, a lot of small businesses use these kind of tools, whether they use something like
yeah.
WordPress, whether they use a Squarespace or a solution provided by a provider where they don't have to think about the servers or the code or the back end. These are provided as a service for them. And I think in many cases, TLS will be part of that. So if you have a website and it's running on a third-party service, they will provide that for you. So I think in some cases, it will be considered part of other infrastructure and handled for the small businesses. But I think in the cases where they want to handle it themselves, once they get over the initial setup, the automation is actually much smoother and much easier to maintain for smaller teams.
Okay, great. Does automation address certificate pinning?
Mm.
I will say this. Tim's laughing because he knows if you're doing certificate pinning to public certificates, stop.
Yeah.
There's not a lot more to be said about it. It's not something
You
that we
need to address
recommend.
certificate pinning. You need
Yeah,
to stop doing it. It's just
don't do it.
so
No
dangerous.
public CA is going to recommend that to you anymore. Certainly we don't. I know many of our other CAs in the industry don't recommend it. It is not a good practice for public certificates. You as the customer and your customers have effectively no control over the CAs, over the routes, the issuing CAs, how those certificates are issued. You don't have any control over that. You don't have any say over that. Things can change overnight in some cases with, say, a revocation, and you don't have any control there, but you do have all of the risk and all of the impact to your customers. So largely the automation doesn't consider certificate pinning because pinning to public certificates is bad and it should not be done.
Great. A very general question. What does CLM stand for?
Sorry, Certificate Lifecycle Management. So a CLM platform is a platform that provides the kinds of things we've talked about here today. It discovers your certs, it puts them together in an interface where you can see them and sort them and report on them and things along those lines. You can set things up for automatic renewal. It will go provision the certificate. It will have alerts. If the server operating system is compatible, it will actually provision the certificate for you. All of that stuff together is what you expect out of a certificate lifecycle management platform.
Okay, great. Is there an expiry time configuration that allows to set how soon the certificate is automatically renewed before reaching the expiry date?
I think that's a good question, and that is largely handled by the kind of something like an Acme client or the actual automation itself. So, for example, to use Acme, most Acme clients, when you install them, they set themselves up to periodically check about all the certificates they deal with, see how long they have left before expiry, and then they will just start to attempt to renew those certificates within a period of time before it expires. I think one of the more popular clients called CertBot, I believe that starts to do that about 2/3 of the way in of the lifetime of a certificate. So if it's a 90-day cert, it will start to try and handle the renewal after around 60 days. But those things are generally flexible and configurable in the client. So there is a lot you can do there. If you want to be more aggressive with renewals, you can. If you want to leave it a little bit closer to expiry, you can do that as well. But most software and automation has sensible defaults to make sure that that's all handled very well.
Great. Regarding automation, what is your recommendation on handling situations where coordination with other entities is required when a renewed certificate needs to be applied?
I would say this one is fairly similar to certificate pinning, unfortunately. We do see a number of cases where, a customer will say, well, I have a big change management process when I change my certificate, or I have to tell a bunch of other entities, or I have to tell customers that I'm changing things. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have to do that. And again, it's very similar reasons of certificate pinning. Those certificates change. They may change on you very rapidly. Your key may be compromised and you have to change it in 24 hours. And quite honestly, for TLS certificates, there's no real reason to have that communicated to third parties. Third parties should just hit the website or web service. They should just see a valid and trusted certificate, which is what you would get from us or any of our other CAs that are in our industry. And it should just work. You shouldn't need to expect a particular certificate or distribute it in advance. If you are doing that, again, as certificate pinning, stop doing that. If there are regulations, let's say, so there's some kind of third-party service that coordinates multiple groups, some kind of government-based entity, they are going to have to change that over this time. But I think the other thing that you might want to think about, sorry to drag the question out a little bit, is there will be cases like this where you may have to consider whether public certificates are the right solution.
Yeah.
So if you have a number of other third parties you communicate with, it may be something that can be solved with a private CA instead of a public CA. So it's similar to certificate pinning in that we would recommend not to do that. But I think it would also be a good idea to reevaluate how and why you're using public certificates there and see if there's perhaps some alternative.
Great. Is Sectigo the only certificate authority considering changing the certificate expiration date to 47 days, or is this a global change?
Yeah, I guess we didn't make that clear. This is a global change. This will affect every public CA. You will not be able, after March 15, 2026, to purchase a certificate, a public SSL certificate of more than 200 days from anyone, anywhere. A year later, you will not be able to purchase a public SSL certificate of more than 100 days from anyone, anywhere. And then in March 2029, that same 47-day limit will apply to everyone, everywhere.
Yep.
Thank you, Tim. What are the negatives, if any, to automation?
Well, if I think you find that a lot of in the weeds IT professionals have a job security argument that they make, which is they say, well, I do these certificates all the time. If we apply automation, then what am I going to do? And my response to that is, you're going to do things that a script can't, right? You're a human being with an amazing brain that has evolved over millions of years. You can do things that a script cannot do. And you can add more value to your employer, not less, by doing those things. So if you're an IT professional who looks at this and views this as a a threat, I would offer that you want to reconsider your viewpoint and start viewing it as an opportunity. Become an automation specialist. Be the first person to automate this. Get your teeth cut on that. Get good at automation and run around automating other things, right? Make that your new career. And you can do things ultimately that are more interesting, that are more challenging, that grow your skill set, that grow your knowledge, and that add more value to your employer. And this is a great opportunity. The people who get in there early and do this automation well are going to be the people who own that automation. You're going to own that CLM platform. You're going to own the management of it. And what a great opportunity.
I think one other thing I'd say that might be considered a negative, Tim, is something I did mention before, which there is potentially in some cases a steep initial learning curve, right? Going in, figuring out what Acme client you can use, what network agent you can use, configuring it and setting it up. That can seem like a daunting task, right? And it's certainly, there is many cases where there is a lot of front-loaded effort that you would have to go to get things set up. But I think it's negative in the way that you have to kind of do it, and it can be hard work to start with. But one of the general benefits of automation is once you've done that and set it up, the rest of the process runs smoothly. You have monitoring on there in case it fails. But it's basically front loading the cost. It's doing a lot of hard work now for a much easier life in the future. And it can be seen as a negative that you've got to do all that work now, but the benefits you get down the line probably offset that, I would argue.
Are 47-day certificates already available in Sectigo Certificate Manager, or do we have to wait for the CAP forum date?
They're available today. They may not be available by default, but a simple query to your account manager or our support team will have them enabled. We've long since allowed any of our customers to get certificates of pretty much any duration from 1 or 2 days all the way up to the maximum available time. So if you do want to try short lifetime certs today, 47 days, 10 days even, we're happy to turn that on. We're happy to facilitate it, and we would encourage people to investigate that if they're ready and willing to. Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing I'll add about that is that sort of thing doesn't have to be an all or nothing. If you've got some systems where you feel like you're fully automated and you want to try out 47 days and be confident that it's working correctly, but you got other systems where you're pretty confident it's not going to be, and you're going to have to get those up and running, and right now you're going to stick with your manual methods, fine, do both. Do some of them 47 and some of them on a 1-year cadence while you're getting things put together. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question, maybe. What about embedded devices that cannot communicate with automation tools?
Yeah, I think that one's a good question as well. And it comes back to a point I sort of tried to make earlier, which is one of these changes are going to force a lot of people to think about whether a public certificate is an appropriate use case here. And I would say if you're talking about embedded devices or systems that aren't connected to the internet, and you say, well, it can't go online to do the domain challenge or get a certificate every 47 days, I would argue that isn't the right place for a public certificate, especially if you're talking about embedded devices. It's probably not a good place to be using the same certificate I might put on, a blog about dogs or something, or a public website. It isn't going to be the right tool for the job. So I would say in some cases where you feel like the automation might genuinely not be possible, an embedded device, an offline or an air-gapped system, I would strongly suggest it might not be, and you would need to reevaluate whether a publicly trusted cert is actually the right solution for you in that situation.
Okay, great. As we're coming up to the hour, I think we'll wrap it up here, but thank you everyone for your many great questions. There were a couple of questions that are very much specific to your use case or to your requirements, so we'll get back to those separately to you. But for now, thank you for your time, and thanks, Nick and Tim. If you've got any more questions, do get in touch with the team. You can find a contact form on our website. Please reach out. We also have another webinar coming up in about 3 weeks' time, explaining the steps of how to choose the right CA in light of 47-day certificates. And you can sign up via the website, and we'll also share it on the follow-up email with the recording. We'd love to see you there, but for now, thank you and have a good rest of your day.